Muy bien. Muy buenos días a todos, a todas.
Good morning, everybody. Be very welcome to this panel on global trends on technology and accessibility. My name is Guillermo Hermida, and I'm lucky enough to be able to moderate this panel with three major experts that are going to give us some key ideas on trends on tourism, accessibility, and technology. And that will allow us to see how the world is going to evolve in these areas in the coming years. I am the director of the research and technical development of the ONCE lab, and I'm accompanied by three major experts that I shall introduce right now. First, we have got Natalie Gonzalez, who's got a PhD on social communication by the University Complutense of Madrid. She's got a degree on journalism by the Puerto Rico University, and right now she is an accessibility technician at ONCE Foundation, and she's in charge of the projects of surveillance of accessible technologies and mobile. Good morning, Natalie. We also have with us Alejandro Gutierrez. He studied filmmaking, specializing in the Cuban school. She has done programs for TV channels such as Antena 3 and Telecinco and the channel Viajar. Right now, he is member of the management team of I Love the World, I Love the Sea, and he coordinates the audiovisual department. We are also accompanied by David Baines, who has got a degree on special education at the UK. He has worked as general manager of the technology supporting accessibility in Qatar. And in the last 5 years, he has been developing services that guarantee accessibility, digital accessibility for disabled people in that country. Be very welcome, all you three. David, from the standpoint of opportunities, which do you think are the opportunities we can detect in the development of technologies that the disabled people can detect?
I think traditionally we've looked at technology trends and begun to consider some of the implications and opportunities. So some of the things that we see happening around us at the moment, which are quite exciting and interesting, are the advent of wearables and the support that they offer us in terms of communication, navigation, interaction. I know that people are looking at aspects like the use of drones and how they can impact on e-commerce and access, and even going that a stage further into areas like driverless cars and personal mobility. And all of these, I think, are interesting areas for exploitation for people with disability. Fundamentally, they're interesting because they take on the form of disruptive technology. If we take as our starting point that existing technologies have not well supported people with disabilities, have not well supported people with disability, the advent of disruptive technology opens new opportunities. So at the heart of the approach with some of these technologies is they offer ways in which we can do the things we do now, but do them differently and perhaps do them better. But I don't think that's where the real opportunity lies. I think that's a slightly dated approach. I think the real opportunity for us looking ahead over the next 10 years lies in the transformation of data. The input and output can be truly differentiated. And we know that we can do transformation of data. We live with it every day. So our experience is that we can transform text to speech. Here in ONCE, there are many, many people who know that we can transform text to speech. And of course, vice versa, we can transform speech to text. We can transform text into symbols, text to Braille. But that's really just the start for where we want to go. What we should be looking at, and what I think is the opportunity that is of greatest potential impact for us, is those new transformations. And they're happening in the mainstream, not just in accessible technology. We're seeing, for the first time, automated voice recognition of video to provide captioning. It's perhaps not yet fully usable. It certainly comes up with some very amusing translations of speech at times, but it exists. We're seeing text to sign language and sign language to text, using technologies like Microsoft Connect to allow that interaction to happen. We're seeing facial recognition online, tagging your friends in Facebook, recognizing faces, highlighting them, telling us who people are. We don't have to see the face now, because the facial recognition is telling us who's in the image. The growth of location-based services. We're seeing the transformation of image to text. For the first time now, we're starting to see technologies that look at an image and make a real effort to tell us what's in it. So I use Google Photos. I'm a keen photographer. And what Google Photos would do is it would look at my set of images and put them into a collection of horses, a collection of my family, a collection of certain buildings, certain places. So we're seeing for the first time, potentially, the beginning of transformation of data held in images into other forms. But we're going even further, where other opportunities exist. We're seeing the potential of taking movement and actions and transforming them into data. And that begins to allow us to pattern and recognize patterns of movement and actions, and move from an assistive technology, an accessible technology that is reactive and says, give me this a different way, towards becoming predictive. If we can predict what people's behaviors and actions are, what do we do? What are the first three things we do when we open our front door? And we predict through sequences and patterns of behavior and support people with disabilities with the things that they normally do at that point, and start those up, turn on the lights, sort out the air conditioning, and so on. Then actually we really do move in a completely different way in terms of what we mean by an accessible environment. So for me, the most exciting opportunities that stay ahead is, I think, for the first time we have a real potential to disrupt the accessible technology ecosystem and look at new ways to do that. And at the heart of that will be transformation of data.
Okay, with regards, we see more and more that cities evolve very quickly. We talk about intelligent or smart cities. We have to bear in mind a ever-changing population. So what are the topics, or what are the questions we should bear in mind, or what are the solutions that we should bear in mind in these cities that are living these rapid evolution, this rapid change?
I mean, if you look at a country like Qatar, now Qatar is fundamentally a city-state. So it's based around one large city. And huge fluidity of change taking place. As we move towards Qatar 2022 and the World Cup, we're seeing a huge amount of change happening to the physical environment and the infrastructure underneath it. So probably the most important thing that we begin to look at then is, how do we make the planning for access to be fully participative? And how do we help people to participate where actually the existing infrastructure is not fully accessible? We don't have high numbers of accessible buildings. The transportation system is predominantly taxi-based, and so we don't have high levels of accessible public transport. And we don't have a history and legacy of accessible information materials. And going with that is we don't particularly have a history of a civil society for people with disabilities. So in planning to deliver accessibility within an environment such as Doha, and if we look further and further across the Middle East, into Africa, if we're looking towards the east, we see this rapid change of city-states happening. And we begin to need to take a very clear end-to-end approach to planning. We need to operate across ministries and functions to deliver joined-up accessibility. And we're currently looking at MADA at research on the policy landscape that's required. Because it's the policy landscape that's going to set up the framework by which this accessibility is going to be ensured. And we're looking at the issues that perhaps you would expect us to: employment, environment and housing, health, social welfare, justice, access to education, to social and community, transport and ICT. But I think that what we're really then trying to do is to think, okay, if we're going to see change across all of these domains in building an accessible city for the future, we need to start from where access is strongest and build upon it. And I think in Qatar that's been around the work that's been done in AT and accessibility through the Ministry of ICT under the auspices of Dr. Hessa Al-Jaber. It's a ministry that's very supportive of participation of people with disability, and which gave us the first chance to look at a blended approach to participation, that we could combine online e-participation with traditional approaches. What we've begun to do, and we'll be testing it over the next couple of months, is trying to move towards models of e-participation. So setting up forums where people with a disability can contribute to the changes that are required. They will start with things like e-forums, e-polls, e-consultation and e-town halls, responding to a series of questions. Now, I think in many parts of the world that doesn't sound that unique, but in a country like Qatar, where actually you begin to reach out to people using a form of participation which they're more familiar with, rather than trying to bring people together in an inaccessible environment, actually that's quite significant in helping give people a voice. So your question really was, how do you ensure change in this constantly changing environment? Is where you use the technology. Again, to use that word, you disrupt the ways in which we normally consult with people and introduce new ways. So we're beginning to see growth of something which I've heard referred to as disruptive democracy in engaging people with technology, with disabilities in new ways. So that's, I think, is at the core of how all of that change will be brought together and address the needs of people with a disability.
Creo que aquí David ha lanzado.
David, I think you have put forward one of the first keys. That co-participation is very important. We need to involve all the different groups and all the activities involved in a city's design. You were talking about officials, and we also need to involve citizenship, of course. And another key that you provided is to put together the two participation formulas, which is online and the traditional way of participation, the physical participation. We need to embed both formulas because both of them have a lot to contribute with. Now, talking about the work that you're undertaking in Qatar in terms of accessibility, how could we plan from scratch a fully inclusive city? Would that be possible?
I don't think it's easy. And I think it's not easy because we need to abandon some of our current thinking. If we're really going to plan for a city maybe 10 years down the line, we need to consider really carefully and anticipate what do we think will be the definition of access in 2022, 2025 and beyond. Because the history of access and accessibility has been that we've been chasing trends. As new digital divides emerge, our role as accessibility specialists has been to try to seek a bridge across those divides. What we need to be trying to do now is to anticipate those divides and plan so that they don't happen in the first place. And that means that we really need to see much more emphasis in our field upon not just research, but innovation and creativity. We need to look at future trends and apply future solutions. And one of the things I've really enjoyed taking part in Qatar is a competition that's been organised by something called Qatar 2022, Supreme Council for Legacy, who basically are developing how the World Cup will be delivered. And they set up an entrepreneurial competition called Discover Amazing. And they set young people, 16, 18 to 25, real-world challenges. And the interesting thing in doing that was they didn't come in with it with the preconceptions that I would. They wouldn't come in with it saying Braille has to be put in place in these buildings. They wouldn't come into it and say we need voice technologies in these places. Because to be honest, they don't really know about those. What they did is they looked beyond that as to how you might interact with technology, interact with the environment in new and creative ways. And that experience of access, we know, can influence design for all, not just for people with disabilities. So what might the trends be that we start to see happening looking to 2022 and 2025? We know that smart homes, you mentioned smart cities, but the idea of a smart home connected to many, many other places will be connected at multiple levels, at the personal, the group, the community, the city, the country. So all of these connectivity will take place. That gives us huge amounts of data upon which those predictions of behaviour can be made. That's going to impact on our concepts of home automation. 20 years ago, we talked about it as environmental control devices. Now we talk about home automation. I think now we're looking at talking about a home environment that shapes itself around you rather than is automated. We're seeing massive developments currently that will impact in the use of robotics and advances in prosthetics. We were talking yesterday, we had a really interesting meeting yesterday about mapping accessibility. We can see how in the next few years, the ways in which you map the accessible environment will be much more through use of robotics, taking routes and telling us what that is, the use of drones both on the ground and in the air to provide us with data on a live real-time accessibility. Increasingly then, planning for accessibility is going to be much less about reacting to what is happening and accommodating needs, and much more about being proactive in developing solutions and predicting what those needs will be. And I think we can start to ask ourselves some questions that will impact upon the cities of future. We can take lessons on design, engineering, from education, and we can apply them across the whole community which people with disabilities live with. What can we take from what we see happening in wheelchair design to be applied to broad personal mobility? If we look at how control systems have been developed and have evolved for wheelchair design, what might that mean for a control system for a driverless car in the future? We've seen the growth of alternative materials in education. If we recognise that individualised education is the pathway for the future, that people will take their own routes to learning, what can we take from that experience of developing content in accessible and alternative formats and apply it to the broad classroom of the future? One of the things we've done so well in our field is we've increased the in interfaces with technology, we've built in fluidity. We've built in redundancy of input. We can touch, we can speak, we can use a keyboard, we can do all of these things. But how do we apply that concept, the lessons learned from increasing fluidity and redundancy, and build that into the physical environment, into the real world, the physical world, rather than the interactive world? So I think looking ahead, if we're going to really look at 2020, that period, 2025, 10 years, we need to question our approaches to accessibility. We need to disrupt current approaches to accessibility. Do we actually know, do we discuss the strengths and weaknesses of the different approaches to accessibility and consider, can they be applied to the future rather than reacting? And that maybe means that we have to think about, do we move away from compliance with standards and much more in policy focus on principles of accessibility, rather than expecting somebody to comply with detail, build in how people demonstrate that in their approaches they're basing around principles. And that means things for areas like inclusive, for universal design. I live in a country which is predominantly Arabic speaking, 90% Arabic speaking. There's a lot of English speakers and other languages. And universal design has got to mean more than accessibility for that community. It's got to be a universal design that takes account of language, that takes account of culture and community standards. The values from within a community need to be something which are reflected if we really mean universal design. What's the balance of standards, policy, and research that we need to undertake? And I think I would say, the fundamental final question, I think as a community of accessibility specialists, looking ahead, talking about the opportunities, talking about the trends, we need to make some very hard decisions about where do we invest our time, our resources, our funding to have the greatest potential impact, not just today, not just tomorrow, but 10 years, 20 down the line. We need a vision of accessibility for the future, and that's what will ensure accessible cities, accessible environments, and ultimately an accessible community for all.
Hablabas, David.
David, you touched upon many aspects that were surprising to me. You talked about proactive design. You talked about interconnectivity of things. You were saying that in the future, we will use robotics, we will make our homes robotic, and we will automate our homes too. This is a very important nuance that we see in the Internet of Things, and we see it increasingly more and more. This is going to change the way we live, of course, and it'll improve our quality of life. And another aspect that was surprising to me is something that you mentioned, and I do think that sometimes we leave behind or aside the issue of cultural idiosyncrasy. When we come up with designs for a city, we need to bear in mind those features that make part of the citizens that are to inhabit it. For instance, the language. As you mentioned, in Qatar, the main language is Arabic, and therefore we need to bear in mind the specificities and particularities in cultural and linguistic terms. I think this is basic. We cannot create standard cities for the whole world because obviously not everybody is the same. I think this is a very important aspect, and we do know that in Qatar you're working extensively with that reference date 2022, as you mentioned. But do you consider that for that date we will hit the landmarks in accessibility that have been proposed, or is it a challenge that won't be met? What do you think?
We will have met some landmarks. But I think it's, remembering to come back to that point, we're living in a time where Our concept of access and accessibility will change year on year. So it's not enough to simply say what will we have achieved against current expectations by 2022, but constantly reviewing what our definition of accessibility is and will be, and revising those landmarks accordingly. We will have delivered some form of accessibility by 2022. Whether or not that will be exactly what by then we define as a fully accessible environment, I doubt, because it will probably be our definition of what we want, won't be possible for another 5 years or 10 years after that. So constantly updating our concepts of what accessibility are means that this is always going to be a challenge to us. It's always going to be a roadmap that we need to follow. But I am confident that there will be considerable improvements in accessibility, and that what our expectations of what we would deliver today will be in place. But we'll have a whole new set of challenges, because the world in 2022 will not be the same as the one today.
Totalmente de acuerdo.
I completely agree, and especially given the speed at which technologies change currently. In 5-10 years' time, we will witness and we will live, if we're still here, many changes that will be completely unrelated with paradigms that we had back in the year 2000, back in the 90s, and of course, we have high expectations for all those technological changes that are to come. Okay, we'll now leave Qatar aside. Thank you very much, David. It's been so interesting. And now we get closer to home so that Natalie can tell us a bit more about what Fundación ONCE is working on, what the ONCE Foundation is working on. We often hear that there are research projects underway, that there are surveillance plans in place, but please, let us know what Fundación ONCE's plan is about along these lines. Well, good morning, everybody. The surveillance plans on accessible technologies that we have in place in our accessible technology department of Fundación ONCE is about, well, it consists mainly on identifying, compiling, and finding information on research and defining products and technological solutions that are accessible and that are also aimed at improving the life quality of people who have special needs. As we all know, technology is constantly changing, and as a result, in the market, we see technological products appear and disappear quite quickly. And this forces companies to face the issue of having to come up with strategic solutions which are more and more disaggregated. And they have been also forced to manage all the information about science and technology in a different manner so that they can innovate, so that they can be ahead of times, ahead of opportunities, and of course, so that they can survive in a complex market, in an increasingly more and more complex market. So this is the objective of our surveillance plan, to provide not just for ONCE Foundation, but also for the Elenion Group, relevant and effective information that will allow them to make decisions assuming the lowest risk possible so that they can anticipate change and opportunities that are coming up in the market. As I was saying, there are plans also in other associations, but what are the key differences or the added value differences that we can find in Fundación ONCE's plan vis-a-vis plans that are being developed by other organizations or associations? I think the main difference in our plan is that we mostly focus on information that has to do with technology for the disabled people. And we have also opted for a methodology that's simple. most importantly, and also sustainable. The starting principle or the basic principle for this plan is that trends in technological development are marked by investments, by the money invested, most importantly, by government institutions, universities, and companies. In order to not complicate our lives too much, trying to find information on the internet, because there's a lot of information on the internet, we have decided to work with 4 sources. One, the government source. It's very important to hit the 2020 or horizon as has been marked by the European Union, and we also abide by the Grant.gov of the US. We also bear in mind research and development programs of international universities such as MIT, Georgia University. We have revisited some Spanish universities such as Carlos III that has a very relevant robotics program. And also, we use information published by private companies such as Google and Microsoft. And also we refer to startups. All the information that we compile is included on a website, and we index it using a thematic approach, and then we do a content analysis so that we can come up with the most frequently mentioned topics. So that's basically what we do.
Percibimos que sí que os tiráis de muchas fuentes diferentes.
So you draw information from different sources then. You get information on Spain, also on the US. So in that manner, you can get a more global vision, not so local, about different technological developments. So on the basis of the outcomes that you have obtained from this plan, what can you tell us about the future evolution? What's the trend in the development of accessible technologies?
Bueno, los resultados fundamentalmente confirman.
I consider that the outcomes confirm trends that are already known to us. There's a growing interest in the field of robotics, and not just in the development of robots, but also in the application of robotic technology for different purposes, also for prosthetic purposes, or for bionic eyes, or hearing aid, or bionic hearing aids. Also, there are many developments in mobile technologies. Apps are currently being developed, and we see an increase in the development of wearables. But it's striking that we don't get so much information about this on from government sources or from the Internet of Things. I think they're investing more on infrastructure. It's because this normally does apply to more technologies and not to one in particular. But the US and the EU do their investments in a different manner. And also there's a very high percentage of data that have to do with technology for disabilities. And once again, I pick up on the issue of robotics. Robotics is being used at large to develop support products, new support products, such as, for instance, smart wheelchairs that can move on their own, and bionic legs, for instance, that provide a very natural mobility. Those are mainly the results, but there's many more, but we cannot be here talking about them for the whole morning. Very interesting, by the way, on the bionic eye. So I hope there's progress along those lines, and a few of us can profit from that technology. You are confirming what David also stated. Robotics and developments along those lines, the Internet of Things, automating and interconnecting things, is a growing trend, an ever-present trend that touches upon many of the projects that people are working on, and we will probably see significant involvement there. We all know about drones now. Currently, people mention drones as if it were a normal thing, and they're still really small flying robots. And, well, to conclude, I would like to ask you, what are the next steps that ONCE Foundation will take to improve accessibility and technology? Yes, Natalie, I was asking you, what are the next steps that ONCE Foundation intends to take along these lines? Well, in Fundación ONCE, we have many ongoing projects that have to do with improving the quality of life of disabled people. Most of them are based on mobile technologies. One example is Medicamento Accesible Plus. It's an application that's going to be developed for mobile devices that provides an accessible version of the labels of drugs. Because as we know, normally drugs have the prescription and the description of the drug in very small font, and we can barely read them. Also, we have Smart Tweeter and Outtake Mobile. I think your university has been involved in the development of this last one. We also have a permanent line of work that has to do with the implementation of European projects. We have information outside on this project, and also Icarus and the STREAM project about accessible tourism. There are many projects, and they're very interesting, and you're working actively on them. I took a few notes, and one of the key takeaways that I noted is that we really need to be on top of the surveillance plan that Fundación ONCE develops so that we can be up to date regarding technological trends, because this plan feeds from many sources, great institutions such as Carlos III, the MIT, etc., etc. Thank you very much, Natalie. Your intervention has been really interesting. Okay, but last but not least, we move on to next speaker. Alejandro, please let us know what's going on with tourism. And how do we link up those two words, technology and tourism? Alejandro, how do we integrate new communication languages within the most traditional touristic experience? I would like to highlight that we're witnessing a revolution in personal touristic experiences, for instance, in virtual reality. Currently, we can have first access to live experiences that you couldn't experience otherwise. And for that purpose, we can use drone technology, underwater 360 technologies that allows us to go to an environment and convey that experience so that the person can live it in the first person. So that's currently giving rise to a change that on the language that we currently use in audiovisual terms. We are now able to show a destination the way it is, and we can promote destinations in a more unconventional way. Now, technology is available and is currently being further developed, and we can offer these experiences and we can display these destinations in a more interactive and realistic way. So what are, therefore, the audiovisual tools that can help us disseminate the existence of these destinations? Well, if we use this type of technology, we could show any sphere. I mean, we could use this technology to show accessibility routes to a destination, or we could see a destination from the air. That would be impossible in any other way. Or we could offer an interactive experience as a guided tour for a museum, or we could even go underwater and you could live it in the first person. So these technologies are going to enable us to get perspectives that could be very difficult to access in a different manner. For instance, we could go and see the underwater world or the top of a mountain. It is now going to be way easier and more affordable than it was in the past. Well, until very recently, this possibility was non-existent. It's a very new possibility. There had been some attempts in 3D computing and so on, but now the technology is available so that we can show reality the way it is. I would love to travel the whole world, but I don't have the time nor the money to do it. So this enables you to travel the world from your own home so that you can see the world from the air, or you can go underwater and you can see a boat that sunk and it's at 50-meter depth. And I have vertigo, for instance. So you could hike a mountain, you could climb a mountain. I know that I will never personally climb a mountain, but I know that I can experience it now thanks to this technology. So it's content-based. What we have to do is to create content so that we can make progress and show increasingly more and more things. Just a few moments ago, you were talking about virtual reality. What's the real contribution of virtual reality for the tourism industry? Well, I think it provides a different way to get to know a certain destination. You may go personally to a destination, but virtual reality uses real imaging techniques so that you can go to a destination for a short amount of time. So you have a large choice and you can get to know many destinations. But this virtual reality will be made available for a majority of the citizenship, you think? Well, the technology exists, but now institutions need to push it forward, and also private companies need to use this technology and develop content for this type of technologies. And that's what needs to happen. We need to make progress as to content development and the ways in which we can show that content. So you need business support for this. Businesses need to push this forward. As you said, the technology is already available, but we need business initiatives to make progress, right? What do you think will be the trend in new touristic experiences in line with this technology? Well, we're almost going back to the same point. From our standpoint, there's a wide array of options. There's many wearables and technologies increasingly more and more adapted to tourism, and we are specialized in this branch. And in this sense, we consider that the trend will be for everybody to have the possibility to get to know a destination and the specificities of that destination personally. And we think that's the revolution that's to come. And we consider that's what's going to change the use of those new technologies. As we saw, technologies will revolutionize our homes, our leisure time, our tourism. And this is something that we have been witnessing in the last decades. It's going to change the many levels of our lives. We no longer communicate as we did 30 years ago. We no longer move or travel the way we did 30 years ago. So there are many evolutions and much progress that will happen in the future. I would ask the three of you to provide a 1 or 2 minute conclusion, really briefly. That's something that I would kindly ask the three speakers to do. And after that, we can open up the floor for a Q&A round so that the audience can ask any questions they wish. David, you were talking about cultural idiosyncrasy. It's very important to bear in mind the specificities and particularities of each society for developing accessible cities. Bearing in mind that each society and social group is different, do you consider that this is being taken into account already, or by contrast, is not as taken into account as we should?
I think at the moment it's not fully taken into account. But I think that's not down to the technology developers or the planners. It's because I think sometimes we're not looking at the trends and anticipating trends sufficiently well and how they will be applied to a specific community. I was really interested by your comments you made about how you're surveying the landscape and thinking about accessible technology. I've realized over the last few years what I need to be doing is not looking at where governments are investing, because governments are risk aversive. What I need to be doing is looking at where are people registering patents and what would be the implications of that patent if it was available, if products based on it were available to the community within which I live. I should be looking at what venture capitalists, who are the real risk takers, where are they putting their money into startups? If I'd been able to anticipate Uber and the impact Uber would have on personal mobility of deaf people in Qatar, because for the first time they were able to identify where to be collected, where to be taken, which preferred routes, without the need to be able to communicate specifically with the driver there. That would have been a really important trend, and we would have realized that would make a difference. How would that work for Arabic speakers? How would that work in different currencies? What cultural issues are there around private cars pulling up at private houses, and so on. So I think we're, in terms of really thinking about how we apply change and respond to change within cultural communities and language communities, we need to be thinking much more in advance, looking at patterns and looking at what startups are developing.
Muy importante.
Very important, yes, startups, what we were saying, that entrepreneurial push, those companies that work and start initiatives. We have to look to what they're doing. Natalie, I know it's difficult in 1-2 minutes tops. Conclusions. You were saying that the ONCE Foundation is developing or has developed apps such as Medicamento Accesible, Desk Mobile, and you were saying that in the surveillance plan that ONCE Foundation has, the app's mobile technology is still alive and kicking with regards to those technology trends. Do you think that in the future we will see major developments or apps that will revolutionize our way of doing things, such as what David just said of Uber, that has been a revolution for mobility? I personally think yes. There's going to be a major leap forward, not so much as the level of applications or apps, but at the level of what we call the UN Telecommunications Union, is the tactile or digital tactile internet, where the information available is going to be immediate. We're going to have a rapid response by technology. And really what is going to change is going to be robotics. Mobile technology will remain a channel of information to be connected, yes, for sure, but it's difficult to know because you never know what comes ahead. Yes, especially in this ever-changing world. And Alejandro, 2 minutes of conclusions. Conclusions on tourism, technology. But my question is, how come these tourism, technological advances in tourism can benefit disabled people? Do you think that really these technological changes and the way in which we do tourism will benefit disabled people? Well, I'm convinced that yes. I mean, of course, depending on the disability or the impairment, if we're talking about a visual environment, which is the one we work, but it's as simple as someone getting these goggles and then go to the bottom of the sea or fly over a national park or see a castle from like a bird's view. I mean, it takes you firsthand to those environments that otherwise you will not be able. So sensitively and sensorially speaking, yes. Yes, because it's what you say, someone who's in a wheelchair and has mobility impairment will be able to go up a castle that is not accessible because there are no ramps, no lifts, or he would be at the tip of a mountain, which otherwise it would be impossible. Yes, he will be able to climb Everest or to just fly with an ala delta or jump over a waterfall or dive in any part of the world, etc., etc. Thank you. Excellent. Well, this is very, very interesting. So, thank you very much to the three speakers. You have really provided major clues on how the future is going to be going. And if it's good for you, we're going to give the floor to the audience so that they can make questions and comments. I don't know if someone has a question for any of our speakers. It seems that we do have. My question is for the last speaker. I'm not sure if in this 3D technology, what is the possibility that it provides to visually impaired people? Has it been developed for this group of people? Well, today, no. We cannot say that it's going to benefit people, visually impaired people, because it's a technology based on images. But it is true that we cannot know. I mean, it's a technology which is at a very early stage. It's been just developed, and it might evolve to that point that you're saying, very probably. More questions?
The tourist experience as we know it now, it's very much about human interaction, human relationship. So how do you think that in 10 years from now, this will also change? It will be more technological experience and less human relationship?
In terms of the tourist experience, no, I think technology will open up opportunities for us as tourists to actually have a much stronger human experience. A friend was explaining to me exactly what Tinder is. Now, I'm 53. Tinder is not something I'm likely to use on a daily basis. But let's take that concept of actually when you get to a location as a tourist, being able to find people of shared interests of being able to find people who communicate in the same language, who share some of your experiences, and actually part of your tourist experience will actually be about engaging with people much more meaningfully. I have a friend who's deaf who said, what I need is when I go to a party or I go to a new town, I need a Tinder that says, find me other deaf people who I can meet who can tell me about this new city. Find me other people who share my experience. And I think that some of these new technologies will connect us to people, and our tourist experience will not just be about what we see and what we do, but enhancing our opportunities as to who we meet during that experience.
Mm-hmm.
Are there more questions? Hello? I wanted to ask Alejandro. It is a very interesting idea, the proposal that you have presented, but I've got a doubt. If we're here talking about Congress of Tourism for All, couldn't it be that this proposal be just for a minor group of people that cannot go and travel and live and experiment as it's been normal? I mean, it's been traditional. Do you have information about the acceptance of a wider group of people, disabled people? How would they read this? If it's just a possibility or a restricted possibility to be able to integrate to the rest of tourists with all the possibilities as we're talking in the rest of the Congress?
A ver, si entiendo.
If I understand the question, if this technology can be adapted to any kind of group of people, yes, but maybe it is for people that will not be able to go and do certain things, but the tourist experience is preferable to live it as intense as possible in the place. Yes, of course. Undoubtedly, this is not going to substitute the touristic experience as such. You have to live it in the place, and you have to feel it. What this is going to offer is the possibility to... It's a communication channel, one more. I'm going to be able to go to some places in a virtual way, of course. It's preferable to go firsthand for any group. It will depend on the tool that is manufactured. There are campaigns promoting tourism, and we did a campaign with Tenerife where we had trail routes where you would do hiking and you could see the bird's view at 2,000 meters height, and you could see the summit. And from then on, you would be going to different trails where you could see with these pictures and videos of this trail. But that doesn't mean that the person will afterwards go and walk the trail if they can. And if they cannot walk, well, they will be able to at least see and get those feelings with those views and images. More questions for our guests? So no more questions? Well, then thank you very much. Thank you to our three speakers, David, Natalie, Alejandro. It's been very interesting about the clues of the future of the technology, design of cities, and tourism. Well, just that's it. Thank you to everybody, and we continue with the event.